Welcome to Italics, television for the Italian American experience. I'm your host, Anthony Tamburri. This episode of Italics features John Gennari, Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Vermont, historian and author, who recently presented his new book, Flavor and Soul, Italian America at its American Edge, at the Calandra Institute. Joining us is Dr. Joseph Schor to talk about the book. Welcome to Italics, Joseph.
Thank you.
We invited John Gennari earlier this spring to the Institute. I think it's a great book. I think it's wonderfully written, and I think it's very important for Italian American studies today.
For me, the book is really about balance, I think. First of all, he strikes this balance between African American culture and Italian American culture. And he does so in a way that, again, also balances academic prose and a personal account. Somewhere in the book, he talks about he wants to present this material in warm tones. So it's not antagonistic. So it's a very gentle kind of book, but very thought-provoking. No one has really kind of looked at that intersect, that the edge, as he calls it, between African American culture and Italian American culture, expressive culture.
It is interesting that he's one of the first to do it in such a profound manner.
Yeah.
There have been a few references here and there along the way, I think, in the last 40 years, but he really digs down deep into it, right? And shows some really interesting and important intersections, I think, that we sort of have glossed over as an intellectual community and also as a sort of general community.
Right. And he's coming at this topic as a scholar of jazz. And so he has all that knowledge and all that background. And he's really attuned to sound. And that becomes a really important part of his book in so many different ways. Not only when he's looking at music, Frank Sinatra, Marvin Gaye, various hip-hop artists, but also just the quality of sound in literature. He looks at Kim Ragusa's memoir, African-American, Italian-American biracial author, and he's just really attuned to sound, and so he incredible writer. His use of words are really wonderful, and so it's that. Again, that balance of bringing these various worlds together that makes this book really pop out and shine.
He doesn't just talk about the African-American, Italian-American individual. He talks about, on one hand, the Italian-Americans, on the other hand, the African-Americans, and how their separate practices sort of reflect one another, even though they're not aware of the dialogue in which they're engaging. And that, I think, is a really important aspect of the book.
And not only does that, he takes it even further because he says that these two cultures, both separately and in their interaction, really have profoundly changed American culture, greatly influenced American culture. And literally at that intersect, that's where that action happens.
Yeah. There's a really nice sort of personal story that comes in, and bingo, it slides right into what he wants to analyze.
Yeah, it's not autobiography as scholarship. It's tapping the personal to make these larger points and to sort of interweave them with the greater story. And I think there is always that danger of the me, sort of self-reflective kind of scholarship that can often go off the rails. John succeeds in not doing that and keeping everything on track and weaving them together really well. We
learn about some of the early characters in Italian American history that we didn't know, that they weren't maybe as pleasant sometimes as we thought they were, that there were some issues along the way, and I think that's important too, because he does it with a great deal of aplomb. He's not mean. He's analytical, but he's not mean.
As he says repeatedly, he's looking at both those moments where people connect, but also where there's a disconnect, where there's a conflict. And so he doesn't shy away from certain aspects of this history, but incorporates it, but sees it as part of that dialogue, both positive and negative.
When I started thinking about this topic back in the early 90s, my work was centered in mostly in African American studies. I was trained in the interdisciplinary field of American studies, and I didn't know there was a field called Italian American Studies, honestly. And I wrote a very short essay called Passing for Italian, Crooners and Gangsters in Crossover Culture, that was published in 1996 when I was a fellow at the W.B. Du Bois Institute of African and African American Studies at Harvard. And it came about at that time because there was so much stuff going on in the culture, in the media, in our politics that that related directly to the issues I end up elaborating in this book. But I also did it because I was encouraged to do so by my fellow scholars at the Du Bois Institute, in particular the African American scholars, who really liked the idea that I would take a closer look at my own culture in relation to African American culture and think about whiteness and think about what I've come to call the edge and the contact zone between these cultures. And that was the orientation, in other words, with which I started this book, and trying to think about race and ethnicity not only in these, kind of balkanized groups, African American culture, Italian American culture, etc. We all know that we live our lives in ways that that defy that kind of scholarly kind of breaking up of people and culture. We need to get a deeper understanding of Italian Americans and their history in relation to our own family and families, but we also need to understand the connections that we've had with other groups, and all those other groups need to be doing that kind of work as well. And so that's the context in which I'd like to think about what I'm doing in this book. It's a book that's largely about cultural representation and performance in music, film, sport, and food and foodways. But it's also my story. Let me show you a few images. I love this cover. I thought I was going to have to really fight hard for the cover. The University of Chicago Press puts up a fight with most of its authors. They have, I think, a really unjustly celebrated reputation for their covers. They win a lot of awards. Most of them are very conservative, and the color scheme of this cover and also the design is very unusual for the press. And so I was pleasantly surprised when they sent it along. It's mimicking kind of late 50s, early 60s Blue Note records and Riverside jazz record design, the typography. That color scheme was one that for a couple of years Blue Note used. Neither of these performers recorded for Blue Note, but I think it captures that kind of retro jazz look. And of course that's Count Basie in the foreground and Sinatra in the background. And they developed a very important recording relationship in the early 60s. So much of my book is about the way that Black and Italian culture is really centrally kind of nurtured through the intersection of sound and food. I grew up thinking that these two gentlemen's names were the great Frank Sinatra and the great Joe Louis. That's the way they were always referred to by my Italian uncles. This is from the 40s. You can see it's Sinatra and Joe Louis in their prime. But this book really started for me with this Sinatra, the Sinatra who in the 1990s began to be appropriated as an icon by young Black men in the hip-hop world, such as Jay-Z here, Jay-Z versus Sinatra, American Gangster, Puff Daddy calling himself the Black Sinatra. That essay that I talked about earlier was triggered by an essay that was in Vibe magazine in 1995 by a writer, a Brooklyn-based writer named Bones Malone, who was I think the most interesting of the hip hop writers of that generation. He had this kind of Black Brooklyn street kind of lingo that he really artfully used to write about a lot of things, but it was mostly what he was writing about was straight up hip hop culture. And then all of a sudden he wrote a piece on Sinatra called the Sinatra, the OG, the original gangsta, and said some really interesting stuff about the way that Black men of his generation thought of Sinatra as a hero, as a kind of an ethnic outsider who became the ultimate insider. So somebody who had to fight for recognition, but then when he got it, He became a man with a kind of grandiose self, and became somebody who was a celebrity, who was an entrepreneur, who got involved in politics, et cetera, et cetera. And then there was stuff also from the mid-1990s from the rap world like this, Snoop Dogg's The Dogfather. And then, of course, Spike Lee's film, Do the Right Thing. I was hoping for a cover that it would actually get a still like this from the movie, because I thought it really captured a lot of what I have in the book, again, about the intersections of music and food spaces and social spaces like pizzerias, barbershops, kitchens and delis. I mean, these are social institutions in both Black and Italian neighborhoods. And this, is, of course, is a very controversial film. We continue to argue about it. It just hit me at the time as really nailing a lot that I knew from my own experience in these kinds of neighborhoods in terms of Black Italian tension, as well as Black Italian emulation. And in some of the scenes of this movie, there's all of that, at the same time. Spike Lee as Mookie, the pizza delivery man, Danny Aiello as Sal, the pizzeria owner, and Giancarlo Esposito playing and bugging out the militant street nationalist who organizes the boycott of Sal's, but here is just complaining to Sal about there not being enough cheese on the pizza. That actor, Giancarlo Esposito, is a Black Italian. He is the son of an African-American opera singer from Alabama who had a career in Italy in the 50s and 60s. His father was a set designer at La Scala. His father came from Naples but was in Milan when he met Giancarlo's mother. And Giancarlo grew up in Europe, came to the US and lived north of the city, and established a stage career in New York before moving into film and television. Franco Harris, the great running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers and Franco's Italian Army command staff. This is a photograph I got from the Heinz Library in Pittsburgh. These men look very familiar to me, and maybe to you. Roy Campanella grew up in Philadelphia. His father was a Sicilian fruit peddler, African-American mother. Of course, came just behind Frank Robinson in terms of racially integrating Major League Baseball. Kim Ragusa wrote this wonderful memoir about her own Black Italian upbringing, a memoir of race, beauty, and belonging, The Skin Between Us. And I have a section of the book that performs a reading of this book. This is one of the counter demonstrations in the streets of Bensonhurst in response to the mostly African-American demonstrations at the time of the Yusuf Hawkins, the time of the murder in '89. This, of course, was a watershed in Black Italian relations locally. And my book starts here, and there was a lot of circulation of this kind of imagery. And it was noted by many that, some of the, kind of cultural styles enacted by the men who were on the streets were drawing quite promiscuously on contemporary Black culture, even as they were engaged in these kinds of racist taunts. The watermelon is interesting to me for a couple of reasons. As a jazz fan, of course, I remember this Herbie Hancock record and how important it was to people in the Black community, musicians thinking about the sound of street peddlers. Hancock talks about the rhythm of that piece, trying to capture the sound of the fruit peddler's cart on the kind of brick sidewalks in Chicago, and the melody, ba 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 ba, Watermelon Man, as it was being shouted by mostly women on the street, trying to attract the attention of the peddler. But of course, watermelon is quite central to Italian culture in all sorts of ways, to Italian ritual, to the color of the flag, the tricolore. And so there's just an interesting, recursive kind of cultural, kind of circuitry here enacted in these demonstrations and counter demonstrations around the figure of the watermelon. Also quite important to me in this period was this show, Homicide, Life on the Street, an NBC show. And this figure, Yaphet Kotto's character, Lieutenant Giardello, G, who is a Sicilian in the show. And the writers of the show just had this incredibly keen kind of insight into these kinds of cultural tensions and affiliations and disaffiliations. Giancarlo, when I was interviewing him, had just come onto the show as his character was the son of G. FBI agent Mike Giardello is the prodigal son of Baltimore Police Sergeant Al Giardello, affectionately known as G, an Afro-Sicilian who runs the detective squad like an old world padrone and is fond of issuing sage pronouncements on what's wrong with America, such as, "We Italians know that a proper red sauce has only tomatoes and garlic, not all these vegetables the Protestants are always throwing in there." And then, of course, the whole genre of blaxploitation films from the early 70s, which I talk about in my chapter actually about Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing and Jungle Fever, and I make an argument about the way that The Godfather and then the blaxploitation films are the kind of filmic reference points for understanding where Lee is coming from, and in a larger sense, the way that he's, I think, enacting in those two films and a bunch of the early films in his canon. There's something going on, I think, about the concept of neighborhood and ghetto versus neighborhood, and the way in which the Italian gangster films give us real neighborhoods with a kind of sociality and delis and funeral parlors and such, whereas the blaxploitation films picture a ghetto in which the only people that you see in Harlem are either gangsters, right, or victims of the gangsters. And so you don't have that kind of sociality. And this film in particular, of course, even in its title, Black Caesar, in England this film was released as The Black Godfather. And of course it's riffing on Little Caesar. And like all of these New York-based films in the blaxploitation cycle, the plot line is black gangsters essentially trying to eclipse Italian gangsters for control of the vice trades in Harlem. And then, of course, across the river in Greater Newark, in The Sopranos, this is the famous episode where the young hip-hop entrepreneur who goes by the name of Massive Genius tries to get a $400,000 reparation from Hesh and Tony and the family because Hesh had built black songwriters and performers out of royalties back when he had a record company in the late 50s, early 60s, F-Note Records in the doo-wop era. And I write in my book in a section called The Better Sopranos that I thought David Chase and the writers missed a real opportunity here in having Massive Genius as literally a one-episode, one-off character. He was really shrewd and impressive in a way that Christopher Moltisanti was not. And I thought if Tony had seen Massive Genius as an asset rather than a threat and pulled him in to replace Christopher Moltisanti, it would have been quite an effective thing to do in the long game. Dion on the Belmonts. The book starts with an epigraph from Dion. There was something about the sight of those four Italians decked out in city slicker clothes, snapping their fingers and acting like Negroes that must not have set too well with the folks in the Midwest. We were kind of exotic, which meant foreign, and that in turn meant dangerous. Dion, as a solo act, of course, broke The Wanderer, among other great tunes in that period. A blues tale about a rambling man and his many loves set to a Louis Prima-style tarantella groove. And Dion describes the song as black music filtered through an Italian neighborhood that comes out with attitude. Amiri Baraka, then known as Leroy Jones on the left here, and Diane DePrima on the right, both great figures of the Beat generation, lovers. Baraka Jones as Baraka, 10 years later, on the streets of Newark, fighting a battle against people like Anthony Imperiali, who was the vigilante and local politician who was trying to rile up violent white resistance to people like Baraka. I got to know Baraka in my jazz work and knew him to be somebody who, in a certain way, kind of typifies the thesis of the book, that there was, at the same time that there was this incredibly strong kind of animus and political competition between these groups, Baraka was an Italophile, and in his later years complained about the fact that there were no more Italian restaurants in Newark, and actually wrote in the late 60s an essay about white ethnics needing to get in touch with their culture because that's the only way that whiteness will not completely poison American culture. He said, Italian power in Newark is like the Vatican power in Italy. Of course, not just Sinatra, and not just in the doo-wop world, but the larger jazz world. Vince Guaraldi, the pianist who became famous for his Christmas themes in the Peanut series. Part of a scene that I don't write about in this book, but I hope to write about in the next year or so, which is this whole kind of Bay Area, San Francisco, greater San Francisco, Black Italian cultural scene that included Vince, who performed in the late 50s at a club called the Hungry Eye, which was a combination jazz and comedy club. And all the great black comics of the period performed there. And Vince's trio went on the road with people like Bill Cosby and others. Louis Bellson, Luigi Ballassoni, who was the only white musician ever in the Ellington Band when he became a drummer in the band. And of course, he was married to Pearl Bailey. Sly and the Family Stone. And of course, the two white members on the left, the drummer, Greg Erconi, and Jerry Martini on the right, saxophonist. In a certain way, I'm cherry-picking this, but there just was this kind of Black Italian presence in the music scene, both in the jazz world and then in the rock world into the late 60s. This is the music I grew up on. And of course, the Rascals were the first white band that was signed by Atlantic Records, and they were recording in the Atlantic studios at the same time that Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles were recording with Atlantic Records. And they made a point, the Rascals did, and they performed live, only taking bookings if black bands would get to perform with them, which was a hard thing to do in that period. Albert Murray, another person who I got to know in my jazz work, the great writer and jazz theorist, and another of these figures from the world of African American culture and letters, who turns out to be a deep Italophile and spent time living in Italy when he was in the Air Force in the 1950s. And I end the introduction of the book with a paragraph from Murray when he says, "Long before there were Southerners in the USA, there were Southerners in Italy, and it meant a certain climate, a certain hospitality, a certain musicality in the language, and sometimes even a certain kind of violence and tendency to vendetta. In the more learned circles, the European vision of the Italian Southerner is much like that of anyone who understands the American South. The feeling is that of an easeful relationship to culture and a spontaneity that says deep down, the point of learning to cook all this food and talk this way and wear these fine clothes is to have a good goddamn time, man." So again, the intersection of food and music becomes an important theme in the second chapter of the book. And throughout the book, I'm analyzing the figure of the mother in Black and Italian culture and the correspondence between the mammy figure in Black culture and various kinds of Italian maternal figures here in food popular culture. What's interesting about this is, of course, we're all quite familiar with this kind of imagery associated with Aunt Jemima pancake mixes and syrups. But it was a Sicilian woman named Tess Gardella who performed in the role of Aunt Jemima in 3 or 4 different vaudeville productions in the 1920s and in full stagings of plays on Broadway, such as Showboat. Here she is in Carolina Mammy. That one's in blackface, yeah. This one's not. Now what's interesting is there's a book called The Black Scrapbook that was published in 1973 by Random House under the editorial direction of Toni Morrison. And a cropped version of this photograph appears in the book without attribution to Tess Gardella. It's misidentified as an African-American woman. Something I wrote that makes a connection between Leroy Jones and Amiri Baraka's famous book from the 60s, Blues People, and Angelo Pellegrini's 1948 book, The Unprejudiced Palette. This is the Nike basketball shoe entrepreneur, John Sonny Vaccaro. ESPN did a 30 for 30 documentary on him 2 years ago called Soul Man. It was Vaccaro who created that style of shoe with the swish, and recruited people, first Michael Jordan and then a bunch of others, to endorse the shoes. And he was the person who got college coaches to buy the gear for the teams and to wear it themselves, and essentially completely changed the landscape of college basketball with the multi-million-dollar nature of this product line. He's just a very interesting figure, not a coach himself, but a talent scout and a kind of avuncular counselor to young players, almost all African American. He's the person who started, as you see here, something called the ABCD camp. It was originally sponsored by Nike. Vaccaro eventually left Nike, first for Reebok and then for Adidas. But these summer camps that are really the places where the coaches recruit most heavily, he is the founder of that concept. And somebody who is just a good fella, if you will, in the locker rooms and the kind of larger social ambit of big-time college and NBA basketball. Here he is with Carmelo Anthony. And it just struck me at a certain point as a basketball fan how many of the top-tier coaches in the men's game, not just the men's game, if we think about Gino Auriemma at Connecticut, but people like going back to Lou Carnesecca at St. John's and P.J. Carlissimo at Seton Hall and Rolly Massimino at Villanova, the Big East essentially in the 1980s. All the great coaches were Italian, or it was John Thompson at Georgetown, who calls himself a black Italian in a documentary about the Big East. At Louisville, his once-a-year appearance in his white linen suit. Dick Vitale, who before becoming the dominant sound of college basketball as an ESPN analyst, was a coach. He's from Passaic, New Jersey. He coached at Rutgers as an assistant before moving on to the University of Detroit. This is a couple years ago when they dedicated their court to him, and these are some of his ex-players from the 1970s. Rolly Massimino, after winning the championship in '85 over the heavily favored Georgetown Hoyas.
As I've said to John, I think it's an excellent, wonderful book. And I think it's going to be hard to supersede this for a while, because I think he's done sort of the basic, both philological but also analytical and critical work that needed to be done.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think those of us working in Italian American studies can use this as a model for not just that relationship between Italian Americans and African Americans, but for other communities as well. And not just sort of racial and ethnic, but also sexuality, gender, whatnot, just to sort of see that it's not, people are not operating in a vacuum. People, it's always about a constant dialogue.
Thank you, Joseph, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching this episode of Italics. I'm Anthony Tamburri. Arrivederci alla prossima puntata.